And 3. If you have digested the previous videos, a dissection of Hollow Knight's music, mainly, and sound design. Let's approach with a little more concision, but always in detail, go figure, the game's graphics, animation and gameplay. All of this? Yep, because it's Hollow Knight and everything's connected. In Hollow Knight, exploration has its own mechanics. Usually in a game there's already a map, or it appears as you move around. In Ori, for instance, you don't actually need map stones in the first game or Lupo in the second for the map to appear. Sorry Lupo, you're not that useful. Here, until you buy a map, you don't know anything except the sad fact that you do not have a map for this area. Cornifer sells us a basic map, a freehand drawing, but with the main elements, such as the boss room, that we can improve as we go along, provided we previously bought a feather and sat on a bench. Indeed, if one can consult the map while walking, we see the knight taking out their map and it is highly cute. Writing while walking would be a feat. Sorry, you'll have to sit, little knight. And you have to do that again for each area. Also, unlike other games that show our location on the map, here we'll have to pay for a compass if the need arises. The mechanics associated with the map are rather developed, in that the game does not stop when we consult it. We can see the enemies continue to move in the background, we can therefore get attacked. Likewise, we cannot consult the map while swimming, neither can we attack. This realism is one of the keys for us to identify with the little hero, to immerse ourselves in the game, to limit any distancing effect so that our experience of the game is as close as possible to the experience of the little hero in their quest. Furthermore, in the cut content from the game's development phase, there was a charm called Charm World Reveal, which, like the similar Spirit Shard in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, the Secret Shard, can be guessed to reveal hidden areas or breakable walls. The fact that this mechanics has been abandoned shows the emphasis laid on exploration in the game. Sometimes it puts us in danger, other times we are rewarded with a little secret, a lovely NPC, a cute little grub, or another tragic destiny, like Johnny's, a little bug whose blessing we retrieve as a charm at the foot of their tomb, in a temple at the heart of the Howling Cliffs, a temple with a hypnotic atmosphere filled with those cyan butterflies synonymous with lifeblood. Tragedy, but beautiful tragedy, I guess. In addition, the story of Hallownest is only really revealed at the cost of a thorough exploration of the kingdom. The lore's first elements, the first lines of the Elegy for Hallownest by Monoman the Teacher, and the short introductory cutscene can remain rather enigmatic, although the aforementioned cutscene is impressively efficient. Elderbug then confides in us, but it's only much later that the source of this curse is known, for it is the Seer, the last survivor of the Moth tribe, who, in her final words, reveals the connection between the Radiance and her tribe and the source of this infection. This is only possible after collecting enough essence, thus after facing several warrior dreams and dream bosses, which means that we have to explore and come back to places we've already been to in order to learn the whole story. Exploring also means discovering your own abilities. There are of course some direct tutorials for spells and new abilities, but at the beginning you discover the hero's abilities on your own, especially for a key element of the gameplay, the downward attack, the pogo, which allows you to get rid of most of the enemies, except for those kind enough to attack upward or to teleport. Yes, it's you I'm talking about, Soul Twister, I hate you. And that you use intensively in some platforming areas or just to flex in front of your friend the stag. Maybe a tad better, you never know.
Ooh.
Everything is unknown to us. Every time we meet an NPC, we wonder if they're friend or foe. Sometimes they turn against us, like when Millibelle runs away with our geos, yet we can't directly attack NPCs who aren't enemies except for Millibelle, but she hides in her shell and she's invincible. There's Mila though. Poor Mila. Another important point about the gameplay is that there is no HP bar for the enemies. It would not make sense to know this during the exploration. The player, like the little hero, has to memorize the number of hits or spells needed to kill each enemy. At least that's what I do, in order to gain speed and confidence. As for the bosses, not knowing their HP makes us constantly on our guard. Against the Duck Defender, for example, who's rather easy, but has at least 700 HP, the fight can therefore be drawn out, making it more difficult. It is very likely that using a mod with HP bars will change our behavior insofar as we can somehow plan the fight. We won't hesitate to tirelessly strike our opponent if we know that they have little HP left, while in a blind fight we will keep an eye on our soul meter in order to heal, which may draw the fight a little longer. Generally speaking, Hollow Knight's gameplay is demanding and very tight. Whereas in Ori, for instance, we can reach, relatively easily, areas that are supposedly out of reach using bash or weapons in the second game. Here the cuts are very technical and it is extremely rare not to be interrupted when we fall into thorns or spikes. As soon as we get hurt, we have to start again. On the other hand, there is no insta-kill, and in the most difficult sections we will always find some easy enemies to provide us with this precious soul. So precious that it disappears from our soul vessels when we leave the game. They are indeed empty when we start again, as if it had been used to get us back on our feet during a long rest. Another element of the game, regularly pointed out, participates in the game's realistic feel and can make us ponder what we're doing. Corpses. Except for the biggest enemies and the bosses, whose corpses will disappear quickly to avoid taking up too much of the screen, like the boo flies, the big passive enemies at Kingdom's Edge, many of the corpses remain on screen. As for the bosses, if some of them are only temporarily rendered powerless, thus Hornet or the Duck Defender, him, do not die at the end of the fight, others are very dead, which is sometimes emphasized by the game. After defeating the False Knight, we find his corpse in a hidden room surrounded by maggots meditating on his body in the light of a few candles. One can then fight the False Knight's dream variant, the Fate Champion. This aspect could be nuanced by the fact that, as in any video game, enemies, apart from bosses and mini-bosses, reappear. We kill them, but there's no real impact, since they reappear and it's always like this. However, if we take into account the fact that corpses can be possessed and awakened in some way by the infection, as we can see with the broken vessel, this gives meaning to the fact that these enemies reappear while accentuating the cruelty of the fate of these poor bugs, husks condemned to a restless wandering even beyond death. Some enemies return as soon as we enter the room again, which further supports how impossible the task that awaits the hero seems. The NPCs repeatedly emphasize the exceptional nature of what they accomplish, but it's good for fun. I don't mean here that those are new mechanics, just that it seems that there's always something in the story, in the diegesis, the game's universe, to justify those mechanics. Nothing ever seems gratuitous. Death is more generally very present in the game in a very realistic way too, given the many other corpses of Hallownest, those of wanderers, for example, who alas perished after getting lost or after a not very fortuitous encounter, eaten by Widow, or bodies of warrior dreams. Sometimes we even sit on them like Legator's bench, or play with them, right, Nim? I mean, it does look like sausages to me, but apparently this accordion is a bug. Even worse, at Kingdom's Edge, corpses of the unlucky fighters from the Colosseum of Fools seem to endlessly fall from the sky. We can even find Tizo there. It mirrors this long ascent of the abyss, while countless vessels fall on the ground with this disturbing hollow sound. No pun intended. The theme of the mirror is very present in the game, whether this mirror is real, as in the birthplace, or more figurative by this constant opposition between the ascent and the fall, by this playable character whose silence sends the NPCs back to their weaknesses but also reveals their strengths. This mirror is also that of the family when a knight, chained in a temple, confronts their closest family, returns the blows of their siblings who attack them to free them from an inconceivable condition. And maybe in Silksong there will be the mirror that will allow for some introspection for Hornet. In a rather similar but more harmless way, we break the objects around us when we hit them with our nail. They reappear, however, when we enter the room again. With some luck, 2% to be precise, we can cross at the bottom of the well leading to the forgotten crossroads the friendly Manderbug. This destruction is therefore also included in the diegesis. We can find Manderbug's diary in his home, diary in which he mentions those broken things. However, our adventure is not all destruction. I mean, it's still a lot of destruction and there's sadness in the process, but it's not all destruction. Trust me. We save Sly, then Britta from the infection that begins to attack them. We help Floth by protecting her and then giving her strength, although she may die during her quest, depending on how many times we interact with her. We awaken the Nail Masters, delighted to transmit their technique to such a gifted disciple, and thanks to the pale ore we bring him, the Nailsmith finally realizes the ultimate weapon. We can then kill him. But we can also spare him. We bring solace to Zemere by placing a delicate flower on the grave of her dearly beloved, couldn't help, the Traitor Lord's daughter, which turns a game quest into a beautiful moment. And most of all, we give back to the last stag his memory, and consequently, in the heart of his nest, the hope, the very conviction not to be alone, as he is now called the Old Stag. And if defeat is sometimes seen as a failure, in some cases the fight even has more of a sporting, even artistic dimension. The Dug Defender is happy to fight and welcomes us with joy. Galeon challenges us in a joyful combat. More generally, some of the bosses recognize our superiority. Battle is not always synonymous with death, annihilation or destruction, even if it is a bit sad to think that Marmo won't learn to fly with a queen. At this point, we can ask ourselves the question, who are we? We're not supposed to have a mind or a will, so why are we reacting this way to the fate of Hallownest? Why did we return to the kingdom? Is it due to the nature of the void, capable of annihilating the Radiance's light, and would therefore be as if attracted to it? We can see in the Abyss that as long as it's not unified, the void attacks blindly, even creatures made of void, since it attacks us, whether it be the void tentacles or the family. This is not the case for the little hero who only attacks enemies, those who actually attack them, or the infected husks wandering everywhere. And at that point, they do not have the void heart yet, therefore they have not unified the substance from the Abyss. Do they just have instinct? Was the Pale King right? Is there really neither will nor mind in these vessels? Rather than being mistaken about the purity of the Hollow Knight, wouldn't he have been mistaken about the void's true nature? If the knight left and then came back, is it really just because of their instinct? Did they sense a call? In the very first cutscene, they seem to take the time to contemplate Dirtmouth before jumping into King's Pass. Then they decide to do it, they actively jump down into Hallownest. Even in the artworks, the little line is always shown in a very active posture, either jumping, fighting, or just looking badass. The no mind, no will, no voice motto has always been difficult to apprehend for me when looking at the player character. Well, except for the voice part, they do not speak. Of course, the hero's attitude depends on what the player will make them do, but this is only true for specific things, especially ghosts. One can choose to ignore them, make them disappear by using the dream nail on them, or let them haunt Hallownest. But for the friend or foe distinction, it is decided by the game. There are other moments when we can decide. We can sit to listen to Marissa or join Quirrell in his last contemplative moments. We can choose what to do, we can sit and stay with them or not care and leave. But the game suggests that our playable character would decide to do this, sit and listen to them. Of course, the developers might have thought that the player, not the character, would have enjoyed that, but you can't add a mechanics just because the player might like it. It has to make sense with the playable character, especially here because Hollow Knight's developers are undoubtedly crazy perfectionists. They would not add something just for kicks. This means that they decided that the knight would be able to choose to share moments with Quirrell or Marissa. Hollow Knight's graphics show an apparent simplicity. It's an assumed 2D animation, traditional 2D animation, a strong selling point of one of the trailers. With a very drawn appearance, the characters are sketched with a visible black pencil stroke and colored with relatively little nuance coloring. The hero has the simplest design, which draws attention to the myriad details of the animation. A black body with slightly rounded limbs, arms hidden under a grey cape, a white shell to protect the void they are made of, their weapon in their back. Most of the other characters or enemies have a similar appearance, yet this allows for great diversity of NPCs and an abundance of details in their design. For example, small accessories such as the pickaxes of the husk miners that break on the ground and their headlamp containing a lumberfly, the crystallized husks integrated laser beams, Mandelbug's hammer and toolbox, the last stag's decorated seeds, Cornifer's glasses and bag, and Midabel's hairstyle. Their animation is also full of nice details. Although it generally meets the constraints of a video game, the characters have a very short-looped animation. It is extremely meticulous and poetic. Quirrell stands on a bench in the City of Tears, the same wiping his nail in Green Path, the small bouncing effect of Miller's pickaxe digging endlessly in the mine, or the short moment when some enemies notice our presence and then rush towards us. One of my favorite attitudes, rather than animation, since here it's the posture that's interesting, is that of the Soul Warrior when they fire a soul orb at us. This is an interesting mob. They're the only one, or at least one of the very few anthropomorphic enemies without any sound design. Another detail that amuses me a lot is this mob from the City of Tears. Well, first of all, her bun moves and seems to be constantly about to fall. But she also has a very different animation than the other mobs. When she walks, it looks like she's throwing her little legs in front of her, and her arms, very small, are dangling. The other mobs have more realistic limbs. Similar enemies, but different characters, so different animation. She's amusing. Even when some animations are reused, the enemies behave differently. Let's take the two exploding enemies, the Fungoons and the Worms. One is active, the Fungoon, it spits noxious gas. The other one, the Worm, is passive with a blank stare and bloat, like a pufferfish, enduring its bull fate. Different lives. Some places are recurrent in the game, those associated with rest, like benches and hot springs. There's a lot of variety in the attitude of the numerous NPCs in these places. It makes their character easy to understand at a glance. Quirrell finds himself attracted by the kingdom, but his goal isn't clear. He has the time to enjoy a few moments of rest before helping us. His posture is therefore less active than Tizo's, for instance, who's in search of a challenge. The soldier in the spa from the Colosseum of Fools is always here. He has the posture you would expect from someone in a spa. The power of logic. Britta looks a bit frozen on the bench in Dirtmouth. She's trying not to take too much space to allow the knight to sit next to her. She doesn't move much, happy but anxious to be next to her love interest. Regarding the playable character, I mentioned earlier the simplicity of their appearance to show the delicacy of the animation. They're indeed not left out. In addition to the main animations, when they walk, turn, I love turning animations, jump or attack, the hero has many small animation details. They stand up when entering Dirtmouth because if you can dash there, you can't run. It's the same in some shops or workshops. When they fall from a great height, they don't get up immediately. They raise their head, one paw on the floor, and then get up. My two favorite details are the little paw we see when they retrieve an object, often a charm, and the twirling effect of their cloak when the hero charges a super dash, especially when they're on a wall. The sound design of the characters perfects it all with a wide variety of voices and emotions, from the disturbed Nail Master to Mandelbug's demonic singing. Seriously is more possessed than the pan flute in Spelunky 2 soundtrack. Elegance is also manifest in the cutscenes, which are rare apart from the game's endings. They're used sparingly, sometimes it's only 3 shots, like when a Nail Master teaches us his favorite technique. But this contributes to the aforementioned elegance. The glow emitted by the heated metal mysteriously illuminates the Nail Master's face. The initial cutscene and the Fountain one in the City of Tears are particularly beautiful. The prologue and the introduction to the game only reveal what is needed. In particular, at the end of the introduction, in 3 shots of the hero, we understand everything there is to know. Their little legs show the contrast between their size and the tasks that awaits them. Their eyes let us guess what they're made of. Their weapon reveals the adventure that lies before them and therefore us. As for the Fountain cutscene, it is always touching to notice the few raindrops falling from the mask of the sacrificed Hollow Knight statue, like tears. And Hornet's arrival, always quite spectacular, a weapon preceding her and a very acrobatic stance, emphatic, impressive, a weapon held in hand horizontally. It is an elegant way to show her mistrust despite her change of attitude towards the little hero. Indeed, she won't hesitate to challenge them a second time in a place she advised them to look for. Seek the grave in ash. To emphasize her strength, we can see that there is almost no recoil when she catches her weapon. It stops nearly instantly, which is all the more difficult as Hornet's arm is raised and she's looking straight ahead of her. But even more than the characters, it's Hollow Knight's whole scenery that manages to amaze with an apparently modest material. Although what appears on screen is relatively limited, the game isn't zoomed out a lot, and the camera never zooms out anyway, we always see the same amount of information. The kingdom of Hallownest is vast. Just look at the place taken by the Forgotten Crossroads on the map. At the end of the game, the whole screen is filled. It's huge, all the more extravagant as the hero is very small. However, this is what you expect from a kingdom, and I always like to imagine the Queen's Station swarming with little bugs ready to climb on a stag. One might be frustrated that such a kingdom is only treated in 2 dimensions. However, there's more to it. Thanks to the different layers, and by different I mean 1000 layers, and the parallax, the backgrounds manage to give depth and thus volume to this world, making it even more realistic. It is most striking in the City of Tears, with its prodigious size when you manage to see everything at a glance. The different levels of blur are extremely carefully managed, naturally recreating this 3rd dimension. This volume is also emphasized by the music. As I mentioned in the previous video, the chapter techniques from my soundtrack analysis, the careful use of reverb both in the music and then in Unity, and all the subtle work on echo effects, as if the sound was reflecting on caves or crystals or coming from another room, participates in creating the 3rd dimension of this 2D game. With such a vast kingdom, a wealth of engineering had to be deployed to cover large distances quickly. Digging stag tuners, a nice reference to insects by the way, elevators, infrastructure in the mine, even a tram. I really like the fact that some elevators are automatic, as in the mine or in Dirtmouth to access the stag station, while others are triggered by levers on each floor of the City of Tears. In the eastern part of the city, which has a warmer graphic palette and finer materials as emphasized by the different sound design, you can easily imagine the nobles moving around with little bugs as elevator boys. Yep, I'm having fun on my own. Whereas in the mine it is much more practical to use automatic ones. For the comfort of all these bugs, there are even hot springs where you can splash some of them as much as you want. More generally, Hallownest, and especially its capital, reveal a certain virtuosity in the mastery of architecture and materials, metal and glass, and mechanisms, which, although sometimes unlikely or even impossible, such as the bench machines, always seem very realistic, realism at the same time very anchored in the game's own universe, for example through the Lumaflies that act as a light source and fly away when you break the glass that protects them. These engineering feats are evidence of a world richer than it seems. When the game begins, we're only in Dirtmouth's heights, but already the camera lingers on elegant street lamps in the shape of ammonites as in Lyme Regis in the United Kingdom. The fading town is simple in appearance, but underneath spreads out the entire kingdom, whose capital city, remember, is built under a lake whose water filters through the porous rock. I really like the little touch of the stairs leading to some of Dirtmouth's houses in the background and the various signs scattered throughout Hollow Nest. Some of the gameplay's key elements, benches, levers, and machines, probably handmade, are finely wrought. The benches in particular have a design that manages to be varied, almost every bench being customized, yet keeping a common identity at the same time. From what I've seen, it would seem that Silksong places will rather emphasize industry, with the huge foundry, the forge, and most probably the weavers. It will give the game a warmer color palette, also more metallic with more glints, and a specific sound design, with for instance extremely low sounds in the forge. I'll elaborate a bit more on a Silksong video very soon. Hollow Nest is plunged into a perpetual night. The only light sources are the Lumaflies, so it's a naturally artificial light. You can't see the sun in Dirtmouth unless nights are very long. The kingdom is anyway completely buried. It is a closed world, even its gardens, and Crystal Peak is in fact a hollowed-out mountain dug by the miners. This is why the kingdom's colors, although varied, cannot be that vibrant, except for the crystal, of course. We also see the kingdom slip through the physics of the game, not the player character's physics, but the world's physics. There is relatively little physics, at least if we compare to Ori, where the physics are almost hyperbolic, especially in the second game. Some platforms, lighter, react to our presence, others move to add a challenge to the navigation, but quite honestly, we mostly find the physics with the mushrooms on which we can happily bounce. It's another way to show Hollow Nest's stasis, as we make dust appear when we jump, or leaves that have accumulated on the ground when we walk. The color palette is also more nuanced than one might think at first. If blue and black dominate, very quickly some areas stand out, Green Path and later the Queen's Gardens, both mixing the green and purple of the plants as well as the metal of some infrastructures. I do enjoy how they still have their own identity. Green Path's color palette is slightly less green than the Queen's Gardens. In the gardens, the metal is more predominant, like that large gate at the enter or the collapsing platforms, not to mention the huge flowers specific to this narrow royal place. The mine is saturated with pink crystal, especially the hidden room where we find Deep Focus, and the beehive is orange and hexagons everywhere, even the cute bookshelves. The backgrounds are for some absolutely sumptuous. It's also a realm that mixes safety and danger. In Green Path, you walk from a deceitful acid lake to a welcoming source in the background. Like in Deep Nest, an area often unpopular with players, no butterflies here, just follow the spiders. Where after a difficult navigation with enemies taking us by surprise, you fall into a hot spring synonymous with safety. The music in these areas, called Reflection in the soundtrack, is called Safety in the game's audio files. This illustrates the alliance between civilization brought by the Pale King and the original raw nature which sometimes prevails, like the supposedly dead Isma tied to the wall behind her by climbing plants as if they had suddenly decided to take her, or two of the dead snail shamans. One has been literally crystallized by Crystal Peak's pink crystal, the other looks sound asleep as the flora around them reclaim the area. It can also be seen through the combination of the forge panels, for example the panel that announces the Mantis village or the nailsmith's hut, proof of a more advanced civilization, and the rough, mossy stones on which sometimes a few words tell us about the past of an area, like in Green Path. This organic character of the kingdom, an adjective I often use to describe Hollow Knight, is also reflected in the transition between the different zones. The colors fade, for example, when exploring Green Path, and at the very top we return to the graphic palette of the Forgotten Crossroads, where we can save Zod for the first time, or leave him to the Vengefly King's mandibles. Finally, it's also a design that mixes curves and straight lines and suggests immensity. The parallax, some elevators with astonishing dimensions, without ever forgetting the smallest detail, while sometimes relying on so little, since in some areas most of the setting is drawn based on Hollow Nest's seal with the Pale King's crown, proof of his domination and adoration. is sad, that's for sure. But there's a lot of humor in it. Ostensibly like Minibel hiding in her shell like a turtle, or Zote being bullied by the knight in the first trial. And sometimes it's more discreet, like Mendebug and his passionate words about his job as a mender, or the animation. The animation of Hollow Knight has a particular rhythm which sometimes relies on very few key poses. For some movements, when a character appears for instance, there are usually few key poses in between, which gives the impression of a jack-in-the-box. For example, when Cloth appears for the first time in the Fogal Wastes, this is accentuated by her little scream. Or the Nail Master who suddenly stands up. He's sitting, and next frame he's already almost standing up, his nail appearing magically from under his clothes. This lasts 4 frames. Next pose, he's completely standing up. There's some animation on his cloak and arms and the wave front, but other than that the pose remains. The second pose is so short, 4 frames, that you can't almost see it, and even with that pose it's like the Nail Master was sitting and poof, now he's standing and yelling. Little Knight doesn't seem impressed though. Deadpan Knight.
Bam. Finden.
In Silksong, Forge Daughter laughs when the little worker next to her is hit on the head. Again, the lack of intermediate key pose gives a very specific timing to the animation and therefore contributes to the humor of the game. After she's done laughing, she instantly goes back to her former posture, as if there was an on-off switch. Sometimes there's a temporal component that makes something comical. The false knight falls a few times, and when he does, he spins around, but way too much. He starts spinning in the air, which is already a bit odd, then on the ground. It makes absolutely no sense. He just got hit by our little nail. It can't possibly hurt him that much, can it? But since I noticed it, it makes me laugh every time, and again there are only 3 different poses. Or during Dug Defender's stagger, sometimes his laughter is way too long. There's some slapstick too with Zote and Minibel, but I'd like to keep a few ideas for when Silksong's out. I'd like to wait a bit to explore this franchise's humor. It is already rich, but Silksong may add even more components, and I'm quite impatient to see that actually. Will Hornet be as deadpan as her little sibling? Hollow Knight uses everything it has at its disposal to tell the story of Hallownest. We saw that the NPCs were storytellers and that the music too had a vast narrative dimension. But there's also a very strong link between the story and the gameplay itself. The whole video game experience finds its meaning in what the game wants to tell us, and although Hollow Knight takes the classic elements of the genres it belongs to, it sublimates them by linking them precisely to its story. Thus, the enemies' patterns make sense. Most of the bugs are infected, therefore blinded. They have lost all consciousness. We find them trapped in an infinite loop, the crawling insects, blinded by the enemy, like the crystal hunters which fly and follow the hero. In the eastern part of the City of Tears, the bourgeois are particularly unfit to defend themselves. One runs towards us waving his arms, another jumps, looking frightened. Only one tries a simplistic attack with a minimal range. They're not used to fighting and as such present little danger for the hero. On the other hand, they are protected by very powerful guards who are constantly walking back and forth while grumbling. The boss's attacks also make a lot of sense. The False Knight manipulates his spear fairly basically because he has stolen the armor of Egimol, one of the 5 great knights. The broken vessel is manipulated by light seeds and moves in a supernatural way. Hornet, in her second fight, and the Hollow Knight, sharing the same father, have the same gesture to parry. The Warrior Dreams are interesting because their fights are based on very precise effects, gimmicks in a way, which may explain their certain notoriety. Marmu is fought by juggling her. Elder Hu is accompanied by his rings. He's not a real warrior, just an infected mage, but still. Gorb casually sends us rolls of swords. Only No Eyes appears a little apart, not attacking, locked up, blinded, inexorably singing a haunting lullaby. It's the same thing with the platforming elements that are linked to the places they're in, the presses in the mine in particular, although it's a classic in platformers. The very rhythmic aspect of these parts offers a beautiful contrast with the shimmering sound of the crystals. Even the White Palace makes sense because it's a challenge that takes place in the deep dream of a former palace guard, a king's mold. All these buzzsaws and spears are only a metaphorical protection that leads us to the paid king, as if the guard, even in the dream, was only thinking about their function, and most of all as if the paid king himself was only reduced to his obsession to protect the kingdom from the infection. As for the Path of Pain, it leads to a memory of the Hollow Knight as a child with their father. When one knows their fate, it's no longer really necessary to explain the origin of this pain. Even this intense platforming section can be seen metaphorically. In a game such as Hollow Knight, which takes place in a world of insects, although anthropomorphic, you could feel that the emotions seem unreadable. All the characters are indeed wearing a mask, they have a shell, thanks to the tireless work of the mask maker. In spite of this, everything is perfectly readable thanks to the animation. Even though I have already mentioned the care given to animation and its efficiency to differentiate the characters, we can go even further and find elements of narration in the animation. The Little Knight is made of void. As such, they have a very particular jump, floaty with a great amplitude, almost impossible. If we look at the movement in slow motion, we have the impression that the jump is made without any impulse and that it is artificially high, as if the hero was held at the end of a wire to compensate for the absence of ledge grab. It is very clear that the hero does not bend their legs before jumping, they just seem to take off from the ground, their legs bend after the jump and when they land. It can create some very pretty platforming, quite surreal actually. However, their stance, even during the jump, and even more so when they attack downwards, shows a certain self-confidence, which is, however, probably only an instinct, seeing how quick they pull out their nail. The hero carries their weapon permanently in their back, but while they pull it out each time they attack, it's only really visible when watching the game at slow speed. It's all the more interesting that there is no combo. Each attack is independent, you never gain the possibility to really do a combo, but you can reduce the recovery time thanks to the very nice quick slash charm. Each attack seems to be completely individualized, so it appears to be a mere reflex. It's also interesting if we compare them to Hornet. She seems to keep her needle in her hand at all time. She's ready to attack, even when sitting on a bench or when traveling, she looks on her guard. Hornet's weapon is metaphorically rich. The heiress attacks with a needle. She is connected to the weavers. Hornet is systematically preceded by her weapon, which she manipulates with the help of a silk thread, which is often seen in her attacks, notably her large circular attack or her movements. Independent, this elegant fighter has written her own destiny alone, like a tapestry that she would have woven. Her weapon is the symbol of this story that she writes, she, Hornet, tireless protector of the kingdom. On the other hand, the little vessel does not have this kind of attitude, which could show that they don't necessarily anticipate the fact that they could be attacked. And yet, it seems that each of the vessels that we meet has or had a nail, as if they very quickly felt that they needed a weapon to venture out of the abyss. This lack of anticipation reminds me of the camera never zooming out. We don't have access to the whole level design, which can be deceitful sometimes, in the White Palace or the Path of Pain especially, or even the fade to black when we change room. What's going to happen? Who's going to be there? These elements also translate the hero's lack of mind. It is also interesting to watch the animation of the little vessel when they sit on a bench. After a few seconds, they seem to fall asleep. For some, it rather seems that the vessel loses consciousness, as if they were only a puppet, when we see the speed at which they straighten up when we wake them up. It's their only idle animation. They don't have an idle animation when they're standing, they have no I'm gonna fall from this ledge animation either. Their attitude never changes except for this bench sleeping or puppet animation. Again, it really looks like they're not really conscious of their surroundings. The new movement abilities are very well incorporated into the game. They are granted through objects we wear passively without having to equip them, the Mothwing Cape, the Mantis Claw, the Monarch Wings, or other objects we consume, Isthmus Tear or the Crystal Heart. The hero appropriates Hallownest somehow, spells are absorbed. I find particularly fascinating the way the hero unifies soul and shadow spells. Besides, often in the animation of the shadow spells, their horns are deformed and get closer to the Hollow Knight's horns, or at least of the vessels. They gain strength until they become almost overpowered. The Bestrix animation is admirable. Coupled with the sound design, it perfectly translates the strength of this spell. It is the most powerful among those we possess. And it is always striking to me to see the vessel turn into a tentacled shadow, very similar to what they look like when they hit the radiance during the final blows. A small detail, you see the little soul and void bubbles when the faces disintegrate? If you stop just right there. At first I thought they were soul bubbles placed at eye level to give the knight the appearance of a shadow, but they are in fact their real eyes when they come back to their original vessel appearance after the spell. I do like how the two elements are related, the soul bubbles and the eye. After all, you have a soul, little knight. Two, even. And here again the rhythm translates the power of this spell. Everything is extremely quick, we barely see the little knights stamping their foot, yet the animation is already over. They unleashed a powerful attack in the blink of an eye. But if the little hero gains rather exceptional abilities, their appearance, their mask remains unchanged. Even in the middle of a super dash, their face doesn't change. I think this goes well with the tight gameplay. We can see the difference with Sully, for instance, the playable character of Unbound Worlds Apart, whose appearance is certainly similar to that of Hollow Knight's Shadows, but with a completely different treatment. The character feels emotions, there's no doubt about it. As for the knight, Sully's face is somehow eaten by his huge eyes, but they change appearance when he is angry or moves something heavy. The more dynamic movements the hero wouldn't be capable of due to their void nature are granted thanks to objects. The wall jump is given by the Mantis Claw and the double jump, very poetic, aerial, by the Monarch Wings. The animation is very beautiful and always coherent since it's a rather vertical double jump, and we can see the hero with their body stretched out, their eyes completely directed upwards. We can clearly see the difference between the two jumps. No impulse for the first jump, the basic jump, whereas for the second jump you need an impulse to flap your wings. For me, this is what best describes the knight's character and their movements. They're poetic. Their gaze seems unfathomable, but we can't bring ourselves to believe they're evil. They're surrounded by mystery because we don't know what really brings them to life and why they act as they do, but they seem to possess an aura that NPCs notice. They take possession of some of Hallownest's deepest secrets and absorb the kingdom by embodying all its powers in a very poetic way. This poetry is also translated by the physics of the character themselves. There are many small details to show their movement, but there's no huge deformation in the movements themselves. As a comparison, Ori, again, is deformed a lot when they fall or jump. It's understandable they're a spirit, and the movements in the two games from the Ori franchise are much more hyperbolic to emphasize the playful, extroverted character of the little spirit. In Celeste 2, when Madeline falls faster, she's distorted. It's different for the shadow spells and the shadow dash, but it's a distortion that shows the way they absorb the kingdom's spells and story. Similarly, the rhythm of the knight's movements remains calm. Some elements require a charge, which will introduce a release effect, but not the movement itself. Hornet, Silksong playable character, is animated differently and especially has a different rhythm, more focused on tension and release, for example with the grappling effect of her needle, which can be seen in Silksong's trailers. She has much more dynamic movements. She runs, she has a ledge grab, she jumps with impulse, it's even acrobatic. She notably has a twist. It's very logical, she's not made of void, she's an assumed fighter, she's older, and has her own backstory. Silksong gameplay promises to be very versatile. And when she jumps, she has an impulse. But if I'm talking about Silksong, maybe this is because it's time to end this series about Hollow Knight. Well, I guess we're done, for now. The lore and NPCs, the music, the graphics and gameplay. So, why do I like this game so much? Let's start with what's obvious. It's a beautiful game. I have a particular affection for 2D animation, and the style chosen for Hollow Knight is very drawn, adorable, delicate and always elegant. The music is very rich, from the translucent layers of the Forgotten Crossroads to Soul Master's orchestra. Christopher Larkin manages to underline the lost richness of Hallownest with sometimes just one chord, using spot-on color and instrumentation. The Forgotten Crossroads, precisely the very first chord, is almost like a Madeleine de Proust to me. It really brings me back to the first time I discovered the game. The main theme, the famous leitmotif, adapts to all the emotions in the game, which is all the more disturbing since the vessels do not speak. The narrative dimension of the music must be even stronger and transcend the fates of the vessels. Finally, the story, simple and yet so rich, is complete, a tragedy that seems to be seen only through the prism of the melancholy of those who suffer it. However, Hollow Knight manages to go beyond this haunting darkness, insofar as it's also a game that explores a whole range of emotions. Although the darker aspects prevail and the story is inherently tragic, with each ending revealing its share of bitterness, when the little vessel and the Hollow Knight triumph over the Radiance at the cost of their lives, or desolation when we take the Hollow Knight's place and, depending on the ending, Hornet finds herself trapped as the new dreamer. The game is more than that, thanks to the versatility of the NPCs. It's sometimes poetic, a poetry often tinged with shadow when we think of the encounters with Quirrell, but also kind. The Duck Defender is just the cutest thing, and even comical. Freda writes fanfictions after she's saved by the knight. Willow continuously gives in to her desire to eat. Cerebra rewards us with a kiss, or the Dashmaster, who is not even an NPC, with his own statue to the glory of speed, one paw raised to the sky. The game even offers us a character we love to hate, the unbearable Zod. The Grim Troop DLC brings its share of humor as well, but most of all the promise of a real show, with a Cordian. Even if darkness prevails, it is often illuminated, if only for a few moments, by a brighter chord, an intriguing character, an awareness, and who knows what works with the Nailsmith and Shio, the Nailmaster, create. And thus, by its great diversity, Hollow Knight has a vast metaphorical dimension. As I mentioned in the introduction to this series, I discovered Hollow Knight completely by chance, looking for games that could make me forget a persistent melancholy, as I often say. It really only took me one picture to be fascinated by this game, even before I saw or played it. Watching the Dream No More end and the disappearance of the last traces of the Radiance's light was very cathartic, whereas the classic ending, logically called Hollow Knight, or the Sealed Siblings one, is still hardly tolerable to me. The way the infection is the Radiance's response to oblivion, the days in which it seems to trap the insects that succumb to it, quickly resonated with my own state of mind. Doesn't mean that I secretly wish to infiltrate the minds of bugs all over the world. The vessel's mutism was also interesting because, although similar to the inability to sometimes express your state of mind, it was mostly used as a way to enable other characters to express their own emotions, their fears, without shame, yet without ever considering the vessel as a lesser being. There was also this almost Borderlerian duality between this desire to reach the surface, the temple, then the Hollow Knight's mind in the dream realm, and the story that inexorably dragged us towards the depths, the abyss, the birthplace. Ripping the Radiance's face apart to make this pure blinding light disappear was for me like freeing yourself from all this deep melancholy. It was, in addition to the quality of this game on all artistic levels, another reason why I was so drawn to it. And as I was writing this series, I came to rethink about the link between the Hollow Knight and their father, most likely the cause of the eponymous character's impurity. As I probably have mentioned several times, notably in the first video, the vessel has been elected, they've been considered to be superior, they've been individualized, they've been chosen. But can one really forge oneself as an individual, even more so accept oneself without relationships, without being recognized by and as a friend or a companion? The little hero is not chosen by anyone, they escaped from the abyss alone, a priori. They're also pure, according to the Queen, but their purity seems to act as a guide, a mirror, and often allows the NPCs they meet to accept themselves. Like Cloth at some point. They bring back to life these forgotten characters, like the Duck Defender, so glad to fight. But they manage to do this without talking, without showing any preference to anyone, and that is also very important. Why the Pale King chose a vessel, our little hero doesn't choose anyone. They don't show any particular behavior towards others except their strength, inspiring. And yet the question still arises, are they aware of this strength? Are they aware of their sacrifice? Do we attribute to them intentions that they don't have, as it sometimes happens with some NPCs such as Shio? After all, they're only the player character, one might say. But precisely the fact that the little vessel is the player character allows us to make them human since we control them and can give them particular attitudes. We can have fun bowing to NPCs by looking down, we can bring Milibel in front of Marissa in the pleasure house if we do it right. It allows us to give back their humanity to those thousands of forgotten vessels. They have a very strange position, they are indeed the children of the Pale Beings, they are called the Family, which is all the more confusing since they too were probably only seen as a function in which they supposedly failed. Supposedly, since the king is not immune from a misjudgment. He made a choice which only brought destruction in the end. Maybe the king was wrong, there were two vessels, two kinds of purities. Is that even possible? And both were actually necessary to free Hallownest because it took the little knight to make the Hollow Knight accept themselves, transcend their condition and defeat the Radiance. Choosing the vessel as a playable character is a way to give us hope that we can build ourselves even in the most overwhelming loneliness, and allowing the little hero to accept the void within them and to unify it in order to fight the infection could be a way to make the void's darkness and the infection's blinding light two facets of our own pain, accepting your own darkness to then free yourself from your melancholy. These are personal interpretations, obviously, they are the most important words for me, but of course they are not the only ones. More than a beautiful game, Hollow Knight really raises the question of what a video game can be, but not all video games have to be like this to be excellent though. It is a work, as in work of art, that tells a story through each and every art and element it uses. The sumptuous graphics, the music, sublime. The bosses are very carefully designed and some of their behavior reflects elements of their own story, such as Hornet and the Hollow Knight who parry in a similar way, illustrating their kinship. And there's the fascinating duality of the narrative, tens of thousands of words for a hero, heroes, that cannot speak. This story is told through a gameplay that is both realistic, especially for the part dedicated to exploration, and poetic, like the hero's movements, especially the double jump and the Dream Nail's oniric dimension. It is all the more vast as the game is long. NPCs are rather numerous and encounters frequent but balanced. Their dialogue evolves and we witness their own quests in a wide variety of destinies. If some of them get locked in said quests, Cloth, if she leaves Hallownest looking for enemies that may allow her to join her dead beloved, Nola. Others succumb to the infection, like Mila, in front of sad and powerless witnesses, like Elderbug. Some characters leave Dirtmouth, others stay when they're not unaware of Hallownest's fate. Sometimes they're just ghosts and the encounter is touching though ephemeral. But while the game is long, it is also very balanced and very well built, with a relatively linear progression at first, although even at the beginning in the Forgotten Crossroads we have a lot of choices and can explore quite a lot already, and then very open. Some areas seem less important, like the Hive, completely optional, but it is quite consistent with their place in the story. It also adapts to all players, offering challenges of range to transcendent difficulty, whether in combat or in platforming. Finally, artistically, it is a game that unifies. To all the hand-drawn elements, it adds effects generated by Unity. To music, essentially made by a computer, it mixes live instrumentalists. To an Unreal world only made of insects, it offers much more than a realistic and ingenious setting, a oniric story with yet deeply human emotions and questions. Like the little hero who unifies the void, Hollow Knight transcends contrasts, goes beyond oxymorons, exploring a world richer than just darkness and light, revealing a mosaic of melancholy that can free us for a few moments of our own obscurity.